Welcome back to the class, everyone. Do not be alarmed. There is not currently, at least, a Galactic Legend Leia Lightspeed bundle out there. The reason why I say that is because we typically only do this type of video when a Lightspeed bundle comes out and a lot of people start to unlock the character in droves. However, we're making this video right now because so many of you have asked for it. So here you go. As always in these how-to videos, one of the things that we're trying to accomplish is informing people on what comps they should be using, where they should be using them, what Zetas are needed, Omicrons, mods, etc. So the first thing that I want to go over that's going to kind of bleed into the other sections is the overall comps you want to be using in GAC 3v3 and 5v5. In 3v3, it's very simple. As long as there isn't some strange datacron like the Omicron, the most ideal team is going to be Leia, R2, as well as Captain Drogon. Leia obviously is the leader and has a lot of survivability. R2 is there for support and overall stat boosting, and then Drogon is the one actually dealing a lot of the major damage. There's really not a lot of controversy on this. Again, the only time this changes is if there's a huge datacron out there, which for what it's worth, if you have that, you drop R2 for Fulcrum, and then you maybe occasionally stop SLKR. Actually, that happened to us last week, which is pretty cool. Now, with that being said, when we go to 5v5, those three core are obviously going to stay, but we're going to need to add two more characters to the list. And believe it or not, the two most ideal for Leia are actually going to be Old Ben as well as Captain Rex. Old Ben just makes a ton of sense because he has the Rebel tag, so he kind of fits in there. And then in addition to that, with him being a tank, that is going to naturally provide coverage for Leia and really hamper the enemy team. And we'll get into a little bit of why it's important that he can taunt and take the focus away from Leia when we get into the Zetas and overall. But in addition to that, Leia's kit is also giving 100% defense for Jedi Rebel tanks, which will be Old Ben and Kanan. Kanan, unfortunately, doesn't have as much overall utility and quite frankly has a better home with Phoenix, which is why we're not going to be recommending him for the ideal comp. And then Krex. The reason why Krex is in the ideal Leia comp is because Krex is stupid, and he makes every single team that he can plausibly go on that much better. It's something that's bugged me for a little bit, so ignore my tone. But basically what it comes down to is that they gave Krex really busted overall abilities and uniques, in the sense that when we go into his unique ability, he just immediately right off the bat gets a huge boost in crit chance, max health, speed, and tenacity. And one of the annoying things that's in his Zeta, that we'll eventually talk about this when we get to Zeta priority, is the fact that once per turn that he drops below 50% health, he then recovers 35% health protection and gains 50% defense for 2 turns. This makes it really annoying to kill him and pretty much guarantees that you can't kill him quickly, so you end up having to really focus on Leia, and it makes it very difficult for the overall enemy team. And then on top of that, like we talked about with his abilities earlier, he has AoE tenacity down, which is nuts, and then daze on all enemies for 2 turns, and inflicting offense down as well for 2 turns. So a really good slew of debuffs that he just gets to constantly spread, and it's not fun to go against. Again, he makes every single team that he can be put on better, and Leia isn't really an exception to that. Now, granted, I realize a lot of you out there are thinking, I don't want to give up what is essentially my entire Phoenix team just to make Leia 5-10% better. So what are some alternatives you can look at? And we kind of have them right here. First up is going to be Stormtrooper Han. He's a pretty good tank and does have the Rebel tag, so he does get to fill that role. The reason why he doesn't fit in the ideal comp, and really the reason why none of these characters are going to fit in the ideal comp, is because when it comes to overall tanking, his taunt just is not sticky. It is on a 4-turn cooldown, and it does last for 2 or 3 turns, but if it gets dispelled, then he just kind of sits there for several turns at a time, not really doing much. The same pretty much can be said about Baze, where he actually doesn't have a way to proc his own taunt if turret isn't available, but he does start with a pre-taunt, which kind of can give Leia the upper hand in the very beginning, and then honestly his AoE dispel is also pretty cool to use. Mon Mothma, I actually really don't like Mon Mothma on the Leia comp, but I realize it's a character that a lot of people build up for various GL or GL-esque requirements, so it's something that can be thrown at the team if she doesn't really break the synergy. And her revive can actually be super annoying that she uses, because I believe it can actually revive, revive a random rebel fighter ally, so you can even get things like Drogon coming back, which it's never been super important, but it can be annoying. 3PO, because he just gives a lot of bonuses to rebels, and then enhances Drogon as basic with more exposes, as that's what he does with rebels in general. And then 3PO isn't the best character with Leia, because he doesn't actually get to give, or rather share, all the leader stats, because it specifically excludes Galactic Legends, of which Leia is. But at the same time, his Shining Distraction can keep your enemy team from assisting, assuming the advantage actually gets to stay on them. So overall, you have several other options to fill out the Leia team if you're not able to give up both Old Ben and Captain Rex, or you just don't have them available for whatever reason. So now that we've kind of decided what the team comp needs to look like, we need to talk about the Zetas, because they're becoming a larger and larger crunch, and even though there isn't a Lightspeed bundle available for Leia right now, that doesn't mean you haven't gone after another Lightspeed bundle in some time and have created what is essentially a Zeta deficit. So we have this broken down in essentially 4 categories, and I will say none of these Zetas are trash. There is a hierarchy for which ones are superior, which is kind of the whole point of this section of the video, but if you've applied all of them, then that's honestly fine for the most part. First up, we need to talk about Leia, more specifically her lead and uniques, which are going to be the most important Zetas for the entire team. Her leadership is going to very proactively take out some of the more on-the-edge counters that can still work even if she does have the Zeta, but really make it difficult for them. So starting here, Rebel allies take 25% reduced damage from out-of-turn attacks, and are immune to max health reduction and plague. Basically, the main thing we're looking for here is both JML and JMK have an outside shot against Leia. If we're immediately reducing the damage they do by 25%, because most of their stuff is out-of-turn attacks, that's a pretty big deal. And again, the team is mostly defensive oriented, so we need the team to survive. We can't really rely on things like bad AI, because there will typically be someone on the other side of the field playing. Next up is Forever Our Princess. This is really important just because, again, as a defensive team, it's going to give more survivability to the whole team. So at the start of her turn, all the Rebel allies recover 100% of the health which she received in damage, which is a really big deal, at least from that last turn, because when you take a look at her overall kit, what it is trying to do, you're trying to have, or your enemy really wants to give Leia as much damage as possible, because every single time they get a turn and they don't hit her, then they suffer all these really bad consequences where she's going to be getting tankier, they're going to be losing mastery and defense, and she's going to be getting ultimate charge. So she should be accumulating a lot of damage between each of her turns, and then being able to give that to her allies in both health and protection when they already have full health is really, really nice. And then lastly is going to be the Galactic Legend Unique. This one is typically important on most Galactic Legends, except for ones that just can't be hit immediately right out the gate, like Jabba. Whereas for Leia, again, kind of the whole goal for her team synergy is to go right after her, so her having it is actually a pretty big deal. So those are going to be the most important Zetas. Moving on to kind of the second category is going to be Drogan, Leia, and R2-D2. Or Leia again, I should say. Drogan, we really want to focus on his unique first. This is what's going to allow him to assist out a turn, which the basic Zeta is good as well, but we'll talk about that in the next category. But the reason why we want to focus on this one right now is because this is the one that's going to enable him to attack so many times. Increasing the damage on the basic is good, but it becomes so much better with the fact that he's going to be constantly assisting with this. It also does several other things. Next up is going to be Leia, more specifically her tactical offensive Zeta on her special. Being given call to action for 4 turns pretty much lets her entire team ignore taunt for the entirety of the battle, because it has a cooldown of 4, and she is going to be faster than a lot of her allies because she's a Galactic Legend. So very similar to JMK or JML, except for instead of needing an ultimate to do it, she gets to do it right out the gate. The other special and basic we will leave for other categories. R2, I will admit this one is a little bit of a blind spot for me, just because I've had his Zetas pretty much since day one, even way before Leia came out. They just do seem to synergize very well. Again, not as important as reducing all the incoming damage like Leia's leadership does, but still very important. He's going to be sharing his stats, which with everything that Leia is going to be giving him is very noticeable. And then combat analysis is also going to be allowing them to dispel whenever they critically hit, which is very nice because Leia also gives retribution to all allies on her basic, basically meaning any single time that they can counterattack and crit, they're also going to be cleansing themselves. So next up is going to be the third tier, where we finally have Leia's basic, which really is a fantastic basic. One of the issues is that she's primarily going to be using her special abilities, and then on top of that, you don't really get to target who you want, because again, this is typically going on defense. But when the abilities do actually hit, they are actually really good. So she can dispel all buffs on target enemy, which is pretty nice, and then reduce their speed by debuff, which actually does add up throughout the battle. A whole dispel to the entire team, which isn't as crucial with the R2 Zeta, but it's still really nice. And then the one that I actually like the most is the tank one, where you call all other Rabble allies to assist and then reduce that tank's max health by 5%, which it should be a lot, because if you're having to pretty consistently, or you can consistently ignore taunt, the fact that you're hitting the tank means that you really should be doing a lot of damage against them. Next up is going to be Krex, more specifically his unique ability. We talked about this a lot already, but basically just gives him a stupid amount of survivability that really keeps you from being able to kill him, at least without suffering those consequences from Leia that we talked about earlier. Oh, and also being lumped into this, he's not currently pictured here, is going to be Drogon's basic ability that we talked about before. Again, it's mostly enhanced by the fact that he's going to be assisting so much, but at the same time, having a 50% damage increase on your main damage dealer, that is actually a pretty big deal, and definitely does not deserve to be in the lowest category. So now these last three, I'm not saying you should skip them. I am saying you should leave them for last, because they just don't make an overall difference in what the team is trying to do at large. First up is going to be Rebel Ambush. The debuffs are fine. Ambush itself is probably more why you should be using this ability. These only last for one turn, and yeah, I mean, they're not bad, but again, we're leaving this specifically for last. Old Ben Zetas really are dated more than anything else. He gets a few bonuses when he dies from his unique, which, again, it's not bad, but at the same time, like, the extra 2%, I guess the 2% turn meter gain is when you die, that's in general. But the 20% heal, the 20% protection recovery, like, it's not as big of a deal with what the team is already doing. It's still good, again, but it's not game-changing. And then his taunt that'll stay around for one more turn after it's dispelled, really not that big of a deal at all. We just have way too many constant dispels nowadays that, sure, it's slightly stickier, but, I mean, you look at a character maybe like Night Sister or Chrysanthemum, where it comes back every single time. That's a much bigger deal than, say, that isn't, especially for a Zeta if you're on a crunch. And last and definitely least is going to be Captain Rex's Master Marksman Zeta. You can tell this one really isn't that important by the fact that I don't have it applied, and I'm not really short on Zetas at all right now. The big problem is it resets cooldowns for Clone Trooper and Phoenix allies, and you don't really have any of those. So I guess you are doing it for yourself, and 20% damage increase isn't necessarily terrible, but at the same time, it just doesn't really do anything for the team. And I don't even have it applied to go with Phoenix, because they attack at a turn so many times, it's very rare that the initial hit that Phoenix are using actually gets the kill. It'll probably be Sabine or someone else when they actually go into assist. So that is going to cover Zetas for us. Now that we have our comps, we have our Zetas, I want to talk briefly about Omicrons, and then we'll finally make our way to mods. Omicrons are very simple for the Leia team. We don't really have that many outstanding characters like Emba was for Jabba. Both Drogon and Captain Rex are going to fall into the okay category, meaning that you really don't have to have them to get the team to perform the way you want, but they do make the team marginally better. Actually, just check the win rates overall for adding Drogon's Omicron, and it holds about 5% more of the time with it rather than without it. So again, not awful, not exactly making or breaking the team. He gets an extra 50% max health. I believe there's a cleanse in here and just some other fun stuff that actually comes out with Saw rather than Leia. And then Captain Rex, a lot of people might look at this and think it's a complete waste to put with Leia, because you go in here and you see all these like big bonuses for Phoenix or for Clone Troopers, and when in reality, 60% max health, 25 speed, and 30% crit damage. Those are actually really nice bonuses, especially when you start to compound them with a lot of the other things that are happening in the team. Again, I know I've talked about it 3 times now, but him recovering 35% health and protection, and then adding in that 50% defense every single time he drops below that threshold, adding 60% health on top of that is actually really nice. So again, neither of these are mandatory, but at the same time, they do make the team marginally better. And then the Rebels, so I thought I'd throw them in here, just don't. I won't go into a lot of explanation as to why. You should probably know by now. So now we've covered Omicrons very quickly, by the way. We need to move on to mods. And there is a little bit of flexibility when it comes to the overall team, but it pretty much comes down to the same thing most teams do, being health, offense, and speed. Looking first at Leia, the most normal way to mod Leia right now, what the majority of players are doing, is that they're going for speed and health. And while you can do that, I'm not saying putting a speed set or a speed arrow on her is wrong. That's definitely a way to do it. The reason why you want to do that is so that you can immediately stealth Drogon so they can't immediately go after him with, say, SLKR. The reason why I myself don't actually have a speed set on her is she is naturally, I believe, 12 speed slower than SLKR after you factor in the leadership bonuses, meaning any speed set SLKR is probably going to outspeed any speed set Leia. Again, there's a little bit of wiggle room there depending on where you're at in GAC, but for the most part, it's more of a fool's errand to go after it. So you can do it. It's not necessarily bad. Her taking returns obviously isn't bad, but at the same time, I actually like to go overall for health. You can see here that on top of all the health sets, she also does have health primaries. I've tried not to slack on speed when it comes to the individual stats here, but she doesn't have a speed set. The reason why I went for health is because, again, SLKR should typically be moving first, but on top of that, a big portion of her ult's damage is going to be off of her max health, and then as we previously mentioned in her leadership, I want her base for her max health to be very high, because when the enemies inevitably can't always go directly after her, she's actually going to be gaining another 2% max health every single time, and eventually that'll compound. She'll get really, really tanky, and then her ultimate ability will kill someone, it'll revive, it'll ruin the match for the opponent. So again, really two stats to focus on, speed or health. How much you want to dip into each is going to really, it's going to be ultimately be your decision. Next up is going to be R2. R2 really wants to focus heavily on both offense and health, mostly for the reasons we kind of listed before with number crunch and the fact that he's going to be sharing those stats to the rest of the team. Also, I didn't specifically call it out, but when we look at Forever Our Princess, the non-Zeta portion is going to be giving R2 an additional 75% max health, protection, offense, and potency. So all these values that we're getting from modding, we're going to get more stats on top of them. So the ideal thing to do is to probably have an offense set and a speed, or an offense set and a health set for the sets, and then for the primaries to aim for maybe a health primary with an offense secondary, or just a flat out offense primary like we have here on the triangle. Speed, as always, doesn't really ever hurt, but at the same time, getting those health and offensive numbers in the right place is going to make a bigger difference, because even when he's just sitting there taking no turns at all, he's going to be feeding in to both Leia and Drogon with the respective stats. You can see here I don't even have a speed arrow on him. He has a flat out 14 speed with an offense secondary. Again, if you get an offense set, that's probably ideal. Next up is going to be Drogon. Pretty standard attacker, with probably the exception that I don't like focusing on getting him to crit, just because he's not really very good at it. When we look at his kit, you'll notice that most of his damage is special damage, and when it comes to special damage dealers, their crit chance is abysmal. Not to mention the fact that he's going to be typically fighting off characters of Galactic Legend strength or around there, where being immune to crits or having a ridiculous amount of crit avoidance isn't abnormal. So what I would recommend for most people to do is capitalize on the offense alone. Offense primary on the cross, offense primary on the arrow, an offense set on his other mods. If you can, getting an offense secondary there, offense, offense, offense. You'll see that I'll break my rules a little bit here with the triangle and having crit damage, purely because I don't really have a good offense primary to give him, and this actually does have an offense secondary as well, so I'm not completely losing out here. And he will very occasionally crit on characters that pretty much don't have any crit avoidance at all, especially when you consider the 10% that he's also getting from R2, means he doesn't have a 0% chance to crit. With all that being said, the defense set here really is luxury. You can go with a health set, you can go with a potency set, I guess. His survivability isn't of the utmost importance just because it's kind of low to begin with. Next up is going to be Krex, who you will see we're actually sporting a broken set on, as something we talked about in our video from yesterday. But overall, Krex just wants to kind of be as fast and, I guess, as tanky as possible. You'll see here we have a few different health and protection primaries. If you are going to go with health primaries, that's great. I would just recommend making sure those mods are 6E. I do like having speed on them, just so we can get his debuffs out as much as possible. As we saw, they can be they can cause a lot of issues, depending on what they are, or depending on who the enemy is. And then for old Ben, my main thing is try to get him to 100% potency, which is pretty easy to do with one potency primary and then one potency set. And then after that, work on survivability. Defense or health sets are fine, and then just working on those protection percents, or actually we have a speed arrow on him. You can swap that out for a protection or health if you have a good speed secondary. And then for the primary, I've actually have defense on him, which is really not ideal. I would, in a perfect world where I could customize all my mods, this would probably be a health primary with a really good defense secondary, but you have to work with what you have. So defense primaries, not ideal, but at the same time, you have to work with what you have, and it's not always the worst thing to do. So that is going to be mods overall. Again, Leia mostly focusing on health, R2 focusing on health and offense, Drogon focusing on offense, Krex on speed, and then Old Ben on potency and overall survivability. So that is going to be today's video. I know that many people who did or participated in the vote on the community portion of the channel also wanted Sith Eternals. That will be coming at some point, but until then, thank you for watching, and as always, stay awesome.